So I'm very lucky to work at the National Archives in a role that is around diverse histories. So the idea of that role is very much to uncover essentially more marginalised histories, histories that haven't generally made the mainstream, but where there's a wealth of actual information and records. So I tend to focus a lot on women and gender history, LGBT history, Black and ethnic minority history, and things like that. So I'm just going to share my screen with you, hopefully. Let's just give this a go. Sorry, it's just taking a moment. So hopefully you can now see the slides and hear me as well. Do let us know if you can't hear or you can't see the slides, and we'll try and rectify that. So it's really wonderful to be here speaking to you virtually. Today, what we're going to do is we are going to look at some of the amazing and pioneering venues that have helped build the kind of current queer scene. What I'm going to try and do is celebrate people that possibly in their own lifetimes couldn't be as loud and as proud as maybe they would have liked to have been. I especially appreciate being asked to do this talk by Switchboard because a lot of these clubs and spaces are now almost 100 years old, and it's kind of incredible to reflect on that 100 years, how much has changed, and in some ways maybe how little as well. So it's a real privilege, so thank you very much for the invite. Firstly, for some context, I'm going to cover some background information and then we'll delve into some of the amazing fun spaces that we have in the records. Firstly, I'm going to talk just a little bit about why these records exist and who we are at the National Archives. So the National Archives is the official archive and publisher for the UK government and for England and Wales. It's possibly not the first place you would think of for revealing amazing items about queer club culture in the early 20th century. Our collections represent the interests and beliefs of government, essentially, over the last 1,000 years. So we have 1,000 years of collections and 11 million records. And throughout that, we get a sense of the perspectives of government in the past. So this includes many records about LGBT lives before, for example, partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in 1967. Our records give a valuable insight into how government interacted with and viewed LGBT communities in the past. And possibly unsurprisingly, the state has had a complex and largely negative relationship with sexuality and gender identity over the majority of those 1,000 years. So what I'm going to focus on today, though, is how this has paradoxically left us with many potential sources for LGBTQ lives. And these are really rich and unexpected sources. What we can do is read some of these traditionally kind of negative records against the grain of their original purpose. So items that were maybe gathered for policing, we can actually read now and we can look into them for the revealing kind of nature of club culture and the vibrant social life that some people were able to embrace. So that's really what we're going to be trying to focus on today, the positives that we can find in these kind of largely negative records. Despite the emphasis on criminalisation in the records, the National Archives holds surprising stories of defiance, acceptance, and day-to-day normality. So we're really going to focus on a lot of those today. So just to give you some context of the time in the 1920s and 30s in London where we're focusing. While it was never actually illegal to be gay, the police criminalised certain social, cultural, and sexual practices between men. In the eyes of the law, meeting other men could be deemed as soliciting, and running a club could be seen as running a disorderly house, or essentially a brothel. In contrast, it was never illegal for women to have sexual relationships with other women, or to alter your gender expression, or even change your gender on your passport at one point. Although these things were socially unacceptable. And so, as you'll see, effeminacy and cross-dressing, for example, were widely associated by police at the time as kind of visual signifiers of homosexuality. And so there's a real blurring, particularly in terms of the understanding of the police, between sexuality and gender identity. Ironically, the lack of policing of trans and lesbian identities means we hold significantly less records in these areas of our collections. Although, fundamentally, there are still records. They might be harder to find, they might be less frequent, but they absolutely are still there. So we do have a picture of the wonderful Maud Allen on screen. Maud was essentially part of a libel trial that claimed she was a lesbian in 1918. And she's a wonderful figure, but in her own lifetime had to kind of hide her sexuality because she was known to have relationships with women. And if you don't know about Maud, I definitely recommend looking her up. So essentially, there is a predominant focus in the talk today on men having relationships with other men, and that's because of the kind of biases in the records and the kind of nature of these spaces at the time. Just a caveat around language as well. At times in this talk, I'll use our current terminology, particularly in terms of umbrella terms, to relate to LGBTQ identities. But where possible, I'll use the language from the time. And part of the reason for that is because it seems unfair now to put our language onto people that would never have had the chance to even know that language existed or to have identified with it. And also, so often, particularly in state records, we don't know how someone would identify in their own words or, for example, with their own pronouns. So to get to some of the main theme of the talk, queer spaces in the 1920s to 40s. So despite the persistent targeting and surveillance of queer spaces, there was a thriving queer community who were able and willing to socialise despite the risks that we've identified in terms of the law. Men in particular were able to create both public and private spaces to meet other men, socialise and have relationships. These spaces could be found, for example, in urinals, pubs, restaurants, dance halls, clubs, houses, furnished rooms and Turkish baths. And the images that are on screen are of areas where cottaging was occurring, for example, in Hyde Park. So it's not very clear on this image, but there is a kind of red line about where what they called distressful areas were, where the number of arrests for cottaging were particularly high. So where men were having sex with other men in urinals. And there's also an image of a public urinal, I think from Brixton in 1932 as well on screen. So although these spaces were formed, they were also susceptible to kind of policing, and that's why we have these records on screen. People would also gather in their private homes, although I'd like to think in general these were less susceptible to being intercepted kind of by police and government observations. But there is this example from 1927. So this is the basement flat of Bobby B or Bobby Britt in Fitzroy Square, kind of Bloomsbury area of London. And it was observed over several nights in 1927. So Bobby would hold parties for a small group of his working class friends where they would dance, kiss, and sometimes have sex. On the 16th of January 1927, it was raided by plainclothes police detectives. And because of this, we have this very rare surviving photo. And it's an actual rare photo because it's an image with people from one of these spaces. So often, as you'll see, the spaces that we have images of are empty. So Bobby Britt is the individual quite central with his top off, and it's got Britt as an annotation over his head as well, and that would have been added by the police. So even private spaces were susceptible to policing. However, clearly these people were defying the law and determined to socialise and meet people of the same sex. This talk is specifically focused on London, and that is for two reasons. One of them is because of the bias of the National Archives records. We hold Metropolitan Police records, but we don't hold police records for other parts of the country. So that automatically gives us a very London-centric view. Additionally, there was the most kind of evidence, I think it's fair to say, of a clear, vibrant queer scene in London at this time. So there clearly was spaces in other places and other cities, particularly urban areas. But you get a real sense that London was quite a centre for these pioneering clubs and venues. And we can also see this in a letter from our collection as well, from the 1930s, where an individual says, "I have only been queer since I came to London. Before then, I knew nothing about it." So there's a real sense of association, of kind of liberation and freedom, and maybe experimentation of sexuality that people hadn't been aware of before they came to London. You'll hear in this presentation that I use the word queer quite a lot. One of the reasons for that is it's one of the few terms that we hear people self-describe themselves in this era, in the 20s and 30s. So that is the predominant reason for the use of that language. Many of the records held at the National Archives reflect the importance of London enabling these spaces to thrive. The West End was particularly important as a hub, and from the 1930s, a number of queer-friendly private members' clubs appeared. Some proprietors simply accepted gay men's custom. Others deliberately cultivated a queer clientele, almost like the Pink Pound. These were successful venues that were clearly making some kind of money. Some proprietors, most venues were not queer run, but offered the possibility of protection and a safe space, or a relatively safe space at least. Many of the underground spaces also welcomed other kind of outsiders, as it were, from the era. People who maybe felt marginalised. So there's often migrants, sex workers, and kind of bohemian people in these spaces. So on that note, let's take a trip to our first club. First up, we have the wonderful Caravan Club. So this space was known as London's greatest bohemian rendezvous. It opened in 1934 and was kind of a makeshift private members club in the basement of 81 Endell Street on the edge of Soho, so just near Shaftesbury Avenue. It was known as well as the most unconventional spot in town, and we've got a picture of the ticket that would have given people entry. And some of this language is on there, so words like bohemian, rendezvous, unconventional, all-night gaiety, all these things would have been signifiers at the time that this was a safe space. It was welcoming for people meeting members of the same sex, for example. The club was owned by Jack Neave, known as Ironfoot Jack, and William Reynolds, known as Billy. For the price of 1 shilling for members, all-night gaiety could be enjoyed while dancing to the music of Charlie, the club's accordion player. Undercover police observations took place on the venue, which give us an amazing insight that we wouldn't otherwise have to these spaces. So this is an image from the interior of the Caravan Club. It was described in the records as bohemian, smoky, oriental, so you can kind of start to imagine the atmosphere there. While the picture is black and white, we can also get a sense of the colours and the patterns and start to use our imagination to think about what this space might have actually been like in person. At the front, where there's kind of an empty space at the front of the photo, that was the dance floor area. And although this is a photograph that's taken and is devoid of people, most of the time the Caravan Club would have been packed with people, all socialising and dancing. So from police observations, we have a description of the space from Divisional Detective Inspector Clarence Campion, who described, "The small dance floor was crowded and the number was too large to allow dancing properly. Men were dancing with men and women with women. A number of couples were simply standing still, and I saw couples wiggling their posteriors. And where I saw men together, they had their hands on the other's buttocks and were pressing themselves together. In fact, the couples I saw were acting in a very obscene manner." Metropolitan Police files indicate that soon after its opening in 1934, the club was kept under regular surveillance due to a number of complaints about the manner in which it was run. So, for example, a note signed anonymously by some ratepayers of Endell Street, where the club was, described the club as an absolute sink of iniquity, frequented by sexual perverts, lesbians, and sodomites. So these kind of public reactions to the club led to an increased police interest. Detective Campion's report described the dramatic moment when the police revealed themselves and the club was raided. I waited until the officers had taken their positions allotted to them, and then had the music stopped and said to the assembly, "Police officers are in this place to arrest principals for maintaining the place in a manner likely to corrupt morals. And you are all aiding and abetting." And Campion's police statement also ends with an account of one particularly bold individual, Cyril de Leon, or Cyril Coeur de Leon, meaning Cyril the Lionheart. And he was just 22 years old at this time. So Cyril approaches the inspector in an extraordinary act of defiance. "Well, I don't mind," Cyril said, "well, I don't mind this beastly raid, but I would like to know if you can let me have one of your nice boys to come home with me. I am really good." So essentially flirting with the male police officer. In the course of the raid, 103 individuals, both men and women, were arrested and taken to Bow Street Police Station. During the arrest, Cyril had to undergo the humiliating process of having his face tested for evidence of makeup with blotting paper. The majority of individuals arrested were found not guilty, but it was on the condition that they never frequented such a club again, which I think is really sad, because you imagine finding a space where you finally feel accepted and then having that pressure not to go back to one. The punishment for the owners was more severe. Jack Neve and William Reynolds were found guilty of keeping a disorderly house because there was a charge on the door. It was kind of perceived to be almost like a brothel. Neve was sentenced to 20 months hard labour in prison, and Reynolds received 12. So there's various bits of evidence that were collected in the Caravan Club, such as these photographs, but we also see mentions of letters which have survived. And these give a surprisingly open reflection of what it meant to be queer at the time. One letter is addressed from Cyril to his darling Morris, and it was found during the raid on the Caravan Club. And some of the lines in it are really quite moving. Cyril says, "I was very disappointed that you were not coming to the club tonight," and describes counting the hours until I could see you. It reads much like any love letter from any era between individuals of any gender and sexuality. It was found torn up under the divan in the Caravan Club, so back in this space, with a powder puff, and then the note was retyped into its current format for the police file. We recently had this item on display in our latest exhibition, With Love, which was on at the National Archives. So the Caravan Club essentially offered a sense of freedom, a space where people could more openly be themselves and have a good time. And I think, as Cyril's letter shows, this was a space where people could aim to meet like-minded people for love, lust, and companionship. So next up, we have another club to look at. This is my favourite one we're going to talk about today. This is the Shim Sham Club. So this space actually opened just a year after the Caravan Club. So this opened in 1935. The Shim Sham was a queer-friendly jazz club described in Metropolitan Police records as a den of vice and iniquity. It was right in the centre of Soho on Wardour Street, and it essentially constantly attracted police attention. The club was heavily associated with African American culture. The name of the venue itself was taken from the Shim Sham dance, a lively tap dance originating from Harlem, New York. The Shim Sham seems to vividly represent the ethnic and cultural diversity of London at this time, which unfortunately made it all the more controversial and susceptible to police attention. So the venue was described as London's miniature Harlem, and it was central to black jazz music in London in the 1930s. It had a reputation for being one of the first places to receive music from across the Atlantic. The police raids for liquor licensing give a snapshot of who was in the venue at this time. So we can see on a particular night, for example, there were cabaret dancers, but there was also, as you can see from the description on screen, a Hetty booth of the Palm Beach Stompers, and Cyril Midnight Blake, a Trinidadian jazz trumpeter. Unfortunately, there seems to be no surviving images of the Shim Sham Club, but we do have vivid descriptions from our records, and also we have these descriptions of performers that really start to evoke an atmosphere of the music that might have been playing, as well as what the space looked like. So we know from descriptions that the space had a small elevated bandstand and a curved bar with ample room for dancing, as you can kind of imagine, with this amazing music playing. Undercover police observations noting that the dancing was of an indecent manner. The Shim Sham was also a space for radical politics, including Pan-Africanism and anti-fascist meetings. So while it was very much a social musical space, it also provided a kind of sanctuary from the kind of outside hostility at the time. Again, public letters were repeatedly sent in to police raising concerns about the morals of the club. A local resident wrote to the police commissioner, signing themselves as a neighbour of Wardour Street, complaining that in the Shim Sham Club there is white women carrying on perversion, women with women, men with men, a second caravan club. While we know that women frequented such places and clubs in this era, they are rarely mentioned. But they do come up occasionally, and they're just kind of less prominent in the records. So there's another example on screen, as well as that kind of public letter of complaint that notes women having relationships with other women. So on the police listings of people entering and leaving the club, we have a note that there were 2 women entering the club, both of the lesbian type, which I think is really interesting. I don't know how the police were judging that, whether that was on their actions or an interpretation of the way that those women were dressing. As well as the diverse clientele that kind of courted controversy, the owners of the Shim Sham Club also attracted their own scrutiny. Jack Iso, who was known as Flash Iso, was a Polish Jew born in Russia, and he was a renowned Soho club owner in this era. We've got his naturalization record partially on screen, where you can see a photograph of him. And he was also later associated with things like black market food selling, so he already kind of attracted some police attention. The other owner was African-American singer Ike Hatch. He performed at the club. Hatch was originally from New York and settled in London in 1925. He was essentially the public face of the club. So he already had a prolific figure on the London jazz scene, and he appeared regularly at this time on the BBC, particularly in the popular Kentucky Minstrel Show. So we've also got a picture of Ike Hatch, and that's from 1938 from British Pathé, likely in the Pathé studio. So he was really quite prominent at the time already. On the 5th of July 1935, undercover police first raided the premises of the Shim Sham on the grounds of liquor license evasion, and that was what often they got attention for in this era. The venue was charged with operating as an unlicensed club, and ultimately they received fines totaling £200, which was fairly significant at the time. After the 1935 raid, the venue reopened as the Rainbow Roof, and it was subject to further charges of unlicensed dancing and music in May and June 1936. In a climate of police surveillance, clubs such as the Shim Sham had to be resilient to change. However, it's clear that there was continued demand for these venues, and they were to some extent profitable, and this drove them to reopen, as with the Shim Sham being reopened as the Rainbow Roof. So, to conclude about this club, the Shim Sham is now known as a pioneering venue of its era that has since been championed as a proudly black queer space, but at the time it was pretty unique. So it's been amazing to share that one with you today. The final club we are going to talk about is Billy's Club. So just a few streets away was another prominent Soho members club, Billy's Club. This was the club run by Billy Joyce, and it was located on 6 Little Denmark Street, which is now Flitcroft Street. This club essentially attracted a queer audience, and the acts that appeared on stage often reflected this. such as openly queer music hall performers of the era. And therefore it was a very different vibe from the jazz of the Shim Sham. This was very much music hall performance. The impressive club room consisted of a dance floor and a grand piano, and was more formal and less bohemian than somewhere like the Caravan Club. So we've got an image on the screen, and I think you can tell that it's not quite as hurriedly put together as somewhere like the Caravan Club. From May 1936, the venue was under plainclothes police surveillance, and the observations intensified from October to November that year. In November, 2 police officers entered Billy's club. Straight away, both officers observed that nearly all the members there were male. So we've got a picture of a floor plan that was drawn by police on screen, and also a quote here from one of the observations by P.C. Murray. So P.C. Murray observed when he was there. When I sat on one of the settees later, a male sitting there said to me, "Are you queer, dear?" I said, "What do you think?" Then he said, "Are you coming home with me?" I made an excuse that I had to meet someone else. So I think this is interesting because it's a very open declaration, even in a safe space, of kind of queerness in an era that criminalised your love and sexuality. Furthermore, Murray noted the majority of the males were, and I quote, of the Nancy boy type, and several had rouge and powder on their cheeks. Not only were the individuals perceived to be wearing makeup, but P.C. Miller noted that their hair was waved or dyed, and one individual was highlighted as having pink nails. In this era, police observations consistently related effeminacy and stereotypically female gender expression as a sign of homosexuality. So that's constantly kind of been noted in the records. So on the night of this observation, at 10 o'clock that night, it was announced that the queer musical artist Fred Barnes would sing some of his songs to the eager audience. So he was particularly well known in this era as a musical performer, and he sung his kind of predominant song, which was the Black Sheep of the Family. So it was stars like this who would be on the stage at Billy's. The following lyrics from this song really stand out. "It's a queer world we live in, and Dame Nature plays a funny game. Some get all the sunshine, and others get all the shame." So essentially, these lyrics can be really be read into in terms of sexuality at the time. The image on screen is from the National Portrait Gallery. So on another night, on the 14th of November, police raided Billy's club. Newspapers reported that several people fainted during the raid. Later that night, 37 individuals, 2 women and 35 men, were arrested and taken to Bow Street Police Station. And we've got a list of items on screen that were kind of seized in the raid. So things like a rubber sheath, diary containing men's names, a powder box and powder, ladies' hairnet, and things like that. Newspapers at the time noted the various professions of individuals, which included employees of the club, a soldier, a film artist, a musical artist, and a houseboy. And even just by looking at the professions, you can kind of see the varied clientele that the club welcomed, and the varied classes of people that frequented this space. Those arrested during the raid were tried at the Central Criminal Court on Tuesday, 12th of January 1936. The principal charge was keeping a disorderly house and aiding and abetting. Even those just in attendance at Billy's club were seen in the eyes of the law as assisting and supporting the venue. All were being treated as criminals for their choice to love freely and socialise in queer spaces. The undercover policing of these spaces was controversial and attracted newspaper attention. And it continued to be controversial up into the 1960s at least. The Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, noted in January 1967 that while he was sure that the officers carrying out this very unpleasant work did so with great integrity, it was undeniable that they were exposed to great temptations and might, in very rare cases, be led into behaving as agent provocateurs. And you do get a sense of almost entrapment in these records, that people were conned into thinking that they could be open in front of the police who were plainclothes, when really they were trying to gather evidence against them. Roy Jenkins therefore said, that if there was to be a complaint, he would not feel that he could defend the practice of plainclothes police officers in this era. Later that year, in 1967, the Sexual Offences Act was passed, and that, for the first time in England and Wales, partially decriminalised homosexual acts, but with significant caveats, such as they had to be in private. But this was a significant step forward, if not a flawless piece of legislation. It's ironic in many ways that without the policing of these venues, it's unlikely we would even know much about them. Certainly, it's led to a lot of evidence about amazing gay love letters and photographs that otherwise I'm not sure would have survived. I hope this talk has reclaimed some of these forgotten voices and inspired you with the stories of people who defied the law to live, love, and be themselves, despite the significant risks. These records can play a key role in re-examining traditional historical narratives and putting these forgotten histories to the forefront. In 2017, the National Archives and the National Trust reopened the Caravan Club again in Freud Bar in Soho, essentially backing on to the original venue at 81 Endell Street. We filled it with queer music, cabaret, and artists. And once again, this became a kind of safe space where people could openly be themselves and celebrate queer history and heritage. The reason I originally started looking at these venues was because of the topicality of closing queer venues and spaces back in 2017 and 2018. And in many ways, this is kind of as topical as ever. And I think when you know the context of how hard these spaces were fought for, how temperamental they were, and how people were policed for being inside them, hopefully it gives us more value to the current spaces that do exist. And I guess I hope that the current situation makes us value the physical spaces, physical queer venues even more. LGBTQ people have clearly always found ways to create their own spaces, but it wasn't easy. And that's why it's brilliant that the next event of the evening is a queer club night. So I'm looking forward to handing over to that shortly. Just to conclude, the National Archives has many amazing records around LGBTQ history, and they cover all sorts of angles, as well as these amazing queer clubs from the 20s and 30s. We have records around things as varied as Freddie Mercury's naturalization certificate to the change of name of Elton John. We have records around people like April Ashley, who was a model and transgender pioneer. A whole wealth of information to be found. So if you've been interested in this, I suggest you go to the National Archives website and just look at some more of what we hold through the blogs or the research guidance. So essentially, I can hand over to questions now. I have got a slide that just looks at some of the principal sources that this has used, which are mainly National Archives documents and then some secondary sources. And just to highlight the next event that's on this evening while I do some questions. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Vicky. That was brilliant. We have had a few questions come through the Q&A function.
Cool.
I can't see your video, Vicky. That's intentional.
I put it back on, but I do seem to have frozen. So let me try again.
No worries. While you do that, so the first question that we had was about the surveillance of these venues, and it was asked how much of the surveillance was known to or suspected by queer Londoners at these venues.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Can I just ask first, can you see me now or not?
Can.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, you get a sense that they were quite aware of the policing, maybe not to the extent that it was policed, but there's certainly a couple of examples that I haven't directly picked up on where when the police are asking them things, people in these spaces talk openly about the fact that talk openly about the police, so they don't realise they're talking to police, but they are certainly to some extent aware of it. There are also quite a lot of people who are quite young. They seem like they're kind of experiencing their sexuality for the first time, and so you get a sense that they're quite vulnerable. And so, yeah, maybe we're less aware of the levels of policing. But I do get a sense that there really was a kind of defiance there, that people did know to some extent the risks, but they still kind of continued to defy the law because I guess what alternative was there in some ways, in the eyes of some people at least.
Brilliant, thank you. The next question, Matthew says, I have read a few articles saying that there's new evidence of an LGBT plus community throughout the medieval period. Have you seen evidence to support or disprove this?
Thank you. Personally, I'm pretty sure there are examples, but that's kind of outside of my my period and my expertise. But I'm sure there are people that could answer that. I think it depends what you mean by kind of LGBT plus community. But I think there was quite an openness in that era. But yeah, I probably couldn't comment more than that. Partly, yeah, just because of my my kind of specialisms. I tend to do kind of 19th century onwards.
Absolutely. And another question is, someone said it sounds like a lot of the police descriptions are through their presumably cis het lenses. Any of the clubs you've talked about have been more specifically trans compared to queer as an umbrella term?
Yeah, I get the impression that it's really hard to say because I wouldn't like to put our kind of modern terminology on people in the past, but I think I get a sense that if there'd been a kind of better understanding by the police at the time of gender and sexuality and the kind of different sides to that, yeah, there would have been a lot more trans identifying people being kind of recognized in the records. You do also get a sense, quite hard to describe, but that because there wasn't maybe a visibility or awareness as so much of trans identity at the time, that actually people were experimenting with their gender or whatever the kind of right words were, but that in another era where that language existed more clearly and there were clearer examples of trans individuals, that maybe some of the people in the space would have openly identified in a slightly different way. So we have another venue in some of our records. It wasn't a club, but it was a ballroom called Holland Park Ballroom. And that was sometimes kind of rented out for what they used to call drag dances in the 1930s. And essentially in that space, the individuals there describe themselves as men. They say, we are all men, but they're cross-dressing essentially. And some of them are wearing dresses, half of them are wearing dresses and they're described as queenies, and half are wearing lounge suits and described as kings. But in their own terminology of their description of themselves, they're calling themselves men. And it's just, I think it's quite hard to say for an era where there wasn't the same visibility as there is now of different sexualities and gender identities. But I'd say there definitely would have been, I think, trans people in these spaces. It's just we can't say for certain, and we can't pinpoint individuals as such.
Great, thank you. Just having a quick look. Can you see these questions as well, by the way?
Yes. Do you want me to just go ahead and answer some?
If you're happy to, I was just checking.
Yes, I can do. So I've seen the question, David, about molly houses in the 18th century. So there is clearly a lot of evidence of molly houses. It's not something we really get in the National Archives. So I believe somewhere like the London Metropolitan Archives has quite a lot about those kinds of spaces. But yeah, there are definitely kind of precursors to these kind of more modern style clubs. And yeah, other kind of queer spaces that people were able to make their own. So yeah, I've always wanted to research molly houses more, but we just don't have the material. where I work at the National Archives, but that's a good point about kind of the precursors to the current clubs, or the clubs of the 20s and 30s that I was mentioning. Do you want me to keep going with the questions?
Yeah, if you're happy to, we've got time.
Cool. So we've got a question about Weimar Germany, and there was a lot of queer club culture and activity. So how did that potentially compare to the kind of London, UK scene? Yeah, it's hard to know, because amongst the people on our records, there was clearly a knowledge of these queer spaces. There were clearly kind of queer networks of communication. But I do wonder how aware the average LGBT queer person would have been of these spaces. I think probably not very. So I think it's a case of, if you had the right networks, you would have known about them. One case we have, there was a flyer sent around that was directed at hotel staff, and hotel staff had kind of become a code for kind of queer working class men. So I don't think it was in any way as visible as Weimar Germany. I don't know personally that much more about that, but yeah, I think it was slightly less well known, and yet kind of surprising, because we don't hear about the kind of queer club scene here in that era as much. So they were known about, but yeah, definitely kind of susceptible to the policing. And clearly from the public letters, there was an awareness of them as well, but I think that was very much in the local area. And then there's an extension to that question about how explicitly, openly political were these queer spaces. So I think that depends on the space. I think the Shim Sham is a good example of one that was more obviously kind of radical in terms of politics and things. You get a sense that the Shim Sham, while it attracted a kind of queer clientele, it was very much a space that just attracted numerous kind of people that felt like outsiders. So if your politics were radical, or outside of the mainstream, then you would have possibly felt more comfortable there. And particularly the Pan-Africanism, I think, is quite kind of clear as something that maybe would have felt more comfortable in a space that was central to kind of informed by African American culture. You get less of a sense of that with somewhere like the Caravan Club or Billy's, but actually, I don't think I mentioned, but the Caravan Club actually was only open for 6 weeks, so it was very short-lived, very kind of makeshift, and all these spaces were very susceptible to raids. They were kind of resilient in their own way, but they weren't kind of long-term spaces in general, so maybe they were kind of less political for some of those reasons as well. And so there's another question from David. Were their venues particularly used by soldiers, sailors, speakeasy venues? Possibly, although that's not something I've come across. There has been research around kind of port cities, and I wonder if that might be kind of more prominent in those areas. So there was a research project, Queer Beyond London. I think they looked at Portsmouth and various other places, but trying to uncover the kind of queer club culture outside of places like London. Because yeah, there clearly needs to be more research, but equally the club culture was kind of less visible and therefore less reflected in records. So it's really quite hard to identify. But yeah, it's an interesting question, and I'd definitely like to look into it. There were certainly some spaces around the Soho area that were particularly frequented by soldiers and sailors, but whether there was kind of a queer social life element to those, I'm not quite sure.
Brilliant, thanks, Vicky.
No worries.
Well, that's all the questions we've had in, so unless anyone's got a burning question that they're going to type quickly, then I guess that's all. Oh, we have had one come in.
Two.
We're mixed. Is there a sense of the gender divide?
Yeah, there is. Unfortunately, there are a lot less women in these records. In some ways, you could see that as a positive. Maybe they felt slightly less pressured to hide. They didn't have the law quite on their backs in the same way, so they didn't have quite the same impetus to create these kind of queer clubs and spaces. but equally, you know, it's sad to think that they didn't have maybe these spaces to access where they could meet people of the same sex. So yeah, I would say actually that it's quite low numbers. So I don't know, maybe 10% of people in these venues, in the ones that I've looked at, have been women. But yeah, I'd like to think that maybe that's in some ways a positive, that they felt, yeah, less pressured to hide in these kind of venues in this kind of era. But also you do get a sense that just lesbian identity was less visible at the time, that the contradiction of criminalisation for male homosexuality was actually that it kind of led to a visibility of identity that maybe women didn't have, and possibly trans identifying individuals didn't have in that era either.
Brilliant. We've been inundated with questions.
Yeah.
David asks, I heard the SK Club in East London was the first club where men could dance with each other. Is that true?
Sounds interesting. I've never heard of it before, and I don't even know what era that is. But yeah, I mean, yeah, if David wanted to comment at all on that, I could maybe come back on that one. But no, it's not something I'm aware of. I am predominantly aware of the kind of the records that we've held, and generally they're around the 20s and 30s because of several reasons, but mainly it's to do with almost data protection because of how long ago those records are compared to other ones. So they're the ones that we have open and accessible, because essentially, I guess anything more recent, we're kind of in danger of outing people that might still be alive. And that's obviously, as much as it's amazing to talk about this history, it's, you know, not for us to do.
Yeah, David said it's the 40s/50s, you think?
Ah, okay. I'll have a look into that. No, it's not one I'm aware of, but that sounds really interesting. And I also do think that where we don't have stuff, maybe because it's 40s or 50s, we might get stuff over time. So I'd be interested to see what we get over a longer period.
Would you like to comment on this idea of London theatres being, outside London theatres being viewed as places people could meet?
Yeah. I believe there are some records about kind of theatres and individuals meeting around them. Also, places like Lyons Tea House had kind of a kind of queer association with it. So lots of the spaces. I wonder if it's kind of almost a Soho thing. If these spaces were around the corner and they were nearby, that there was kind of an openness around the kind of theatre scene and Soho in general. But yeah, I have heard about kind of outside theatres being a space, but I don't know much more than that, unfortunately.
Brilliant. Then there's two questions here that I think link quite well together and are almost a perfect ending. One's about where can people read more about these clubs and spaces, and also any advice for someone who's researching.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So in terms of where to read more, Matt Holbrook's book Queer London is brilliant, particularly for this era. It uses a lot of National Archives sources and looks at a lot of these spaces, and it's a really engaging kind of way into the topic, and really well researched. So in terms of a particular source, that's good. We did also have a publication that sat alongside the reopening of the Caravan Club that we did, which looked at, again, these spaces. So there is just a booklet from the National Trust focusing on that as well, called Queer City. So that's kind of a much lighter read and has lots of images, but that could be of interest as well. And there are also some that pick up more on the Shim Sham, because the Shim Sham often comes into books that are more about the Black British Civil Rights Movement and things like that as well. So Gemma Romaine has written a book that that's quite interesting on that, or covers that within it. So there are some books, although I think in general they're still quite under-researched and under-known about. And then the question about advice for someone researching, it depends what you're researching. If you're researching this topic specifically, then a lot of it's about looking for the kind of right terminology from the time, and using it on our catalogue at the National Archives. And you can go on to our website to access our catalogue and do some searches on there. For LGBTQ history in general, we have lots of research guidance. So you can again go to our website, and there's a guide for sexuality and gender research, because yeah, it really depends the advice that you give on the era. You know, the more recent stuff, for example, is much more about positive campaigns and changing the law, but you know, it's less around criminalization and stuff. So there's a real wealth of ways to research. So yeah, if you go to the National Archives website and to the research guide to look at the gender and sexuality research guide, that's the best starting point. But there are other collections that have really amazing stuff in this area. We very much come from the government perspective, but I hope I've shown that there's more than you might think in the government kind of collections. But there are also amazing places like the London Metropolitan Archives that's had loads of projects around LGBTQ history, somewhere like Bishopsgate Archive, who are brilliant, and somewhere like the LSC that's got lots of records in the Hall Carpenter Archives. So yeah, there's tons of places to research, but a starting point would be our research guidance on our website.
And if you go to Bishopsgate Institute, you'll be able to see Switchboard's archives as well.
Ah, yeah, good link.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Vicky. That was really, really interesting.